Don't hear me. That's a big one. Okay. I'm very hot up here. I don't know why. That wasn't, yeah, no, I didn't mean it like that. First question is everybody caffeinated? Good. The second question is, are you buckled in? Because we're going to go through a lot of stuff quickly today. You ready? And the third question is, what was that song? That was not an accident. Oops, let me plug my, okay, so settle in. I'm serious. This is going to be, you're going to have to plug in and focus. We're going to go through a lot. So, welcome. This is the 10th anniversary of this talk, and the hashtag is hashtag ONA17 trends, and we're going to get rolling. So this is the 10th year, and I just want to say thank you all for showing up year after year. A couple years ago, I was doing this on a stage somewhere, and there were people who had to sit on the stage with me because we didn't have enough room, and that was a very horrible hour for them. It's good to have the airspace behind me. So anyhow, thank you. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you for being here. Thank you to ONA. I have brought you some things. So I will be showing you the things as we go on today. Now, for those of you who have been to my sessions before, you know that people usually join me on stage. Robots join me on stage. This year, it's just me. And it's just me with some very, very important stuff for you. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Amy Webb. I'm a quantitative futurist. This is my second career. My first career was in journalism. I teach this stuff at the NYU Stern School of Business. Everything that I do is data-driven. So these are never predictions. These are data-driven trends. And I'm the founder of the Future Today Institute. We advise lots of different organizations all around the world. And I was once on the board of directors for ONA. And I served on the board for 4 years, and along with Tiffany Shackelford, co-chaired the conference back in 2008 when it was in Washington, D.C. So it's been a wonderful journey together with ONA. So this has been a rough year. And I think a lot of people feel anxious. I'm feeling anxious. Put your hand in the air if you've been feeling anxious. Right, we're all feeling anxious, right? Right, and there's a lot to be anxious about, right? Our dear leader on one side of the world and our dear leader in this country have been sparring over Twitter, and a lot of people feel anxious about that. But we're also anxious because we keep hearing that robots are coming for our jobs. This is a robot in China, a robot reporter who actually went on the air. It's AI-powered, and it was responding in real time to these other journalists, and it was answering questions. So, journalists are starting to feel some of that anxiety as well. But it's not just journalists. Everybody's concerned about their jobs. That's right. So we're all concerned. Everybody's feeling anxious. Guys up in the booth, can you start the time clock for me so that I don't keep everybody here for the next 5 hours? All right. So we're all very, very concerned, and it's understandable. The other thing that is keeping our anxiety level high is that we're in the middle of the fastest and most continuous news cycle in modern history. And I don't have to convince you of that. You're living it. And we also know that public media is at an all-time, the trust in public media is at an all-time low. And it's not because of the work you're doing necessarily. It's because we have a bunch of other people who are now telling other people that your work, the quality work that you are doing as a trained journalist, doesn't matter. And on top of everything else, we have social networks that have started to go haywire, that have been taken over by people who would like to spread misinformation. This is a story that I wrote for Mother Jones at the beginning of the year. Actually, I wrote it last year. It was published at the beginning of the year, but it builds on some of the work that I was doing for the State Department 2 years ago when I was talking to folks at State about the likelihood of Russian botnets spreading misinformation, right? And now we have pretty soon Facebook, Twitter, and Google preparing to go speak with Congress about what they know and what they think happened over the past year. So the fears that you have about the future are legit. And the problem with all of this is that in the year 2017, we are standing at the event horizon for the next era of technology. This year is different than all of the other years that came before, and what's about to happen is going to fundamentally alter journalism. We're going to wind up on the other side of this with a media landscape that we may not recognize. So what I'd like to do on the 10th anniversary of this talk is to tell you about the next 10 years. And using the data-driven methodology that I use at work, I want to talk to you about what I see coming. And I'm going to preview for you what's on the horizon in very specific terms, because I want you to leave here today motivated to take some action. So first thing, we are surrounding ourselves with data. We are creating data nonstop. And within the next 10 years, human data will become a new form of natural resource. You've probably heard the term being thrown around that data is the new oil. And there's a reason for that analogy. It's because the way that oil is drilled for, mined for, refined, and then built into other products is very similar to what's happening with our data. Within the next 10 years, we will be transitioning. And this is the beginning of the end of smartphones and computers as we know them today. And I say that to you having just bought a Samsung S8. And I say that to you on the heels of the new Pixel 2 announcement. 10 years from now, our hardware is going to be quite different. It will be the beginning of the end of smartphones. The people who are using our super smart smartphones today will be akin to the people who are now using flip phones. So there's a big cataclysmic change coming for the mobile device market. In the year 2027, this is the time that we start transitioning to wearable computers. And so these might be glasses. They don't look like Google Glass, but really look no different from the glasses that I've got on today. They'll be coupled with other types of devices that help us continue to engage and have those video calls, all the other things that we do. It's just that we'll be wearing them on our faces, in our ears, and on our fingers. Machine learning is going to make the systems in our lives much faster, more able to make very, very fast decisions, faster than we humans can. The problem, though, is that we haven't taught machine learning systems the right stuff. We're teaching them correct from incorrect, but we are not teaching them values. We're not teaching them right from wrong. And that's a difficult task, because all of humanity is one gigantic multiple multivariate regression. So to try to anticipate every single one of the thoughts and feelings and impulses that we humans may have in advance is a difficult task. It's a formidable task. But very few people are even thinking about that right now. And we can see evidence of that in what happened just a few days ago. So after in the wake of the tragic shooting that happened in Las Vegas, Google led for a short period of time with a whole conspiracy theory on 4chan. So the photos that you're looking at come from 4chan. They implicated an innocent man who for a few moments was all over the place online, but all of you know the danger of this. It's hard to erase something that's already out there. It's very difficult to kill an idea. So even though this guy had nothing at all to do with what happened, there are people now, and there will be forever people now, who associate this innocent guy with a tragic shooting. And we're at the dawn of functional AI. So everybody's talking a lot about artificial intelligence. AI goes back decades, hundreds of years, depending on how you look at it. We are at the dawn of functional AI and commercialized AI. And I have news for you. None of you, news organizations, are building out that future. These are the companies that are doing it. So these are the 9 companies that are leading AI. They are Tencent, Baidu, and Alibaba in China, Amazon and Google in the United States, and then also Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, and IBM. These are the companies that are making the decisions about AI, and as a result of that, about the future of humanity. And they, not you, will wind up controlling the distribution of all news. If we don't change course, your future is up to them. And so given what I see coming, that is not based in something I see in a crystal ball, but instead based on data and modeling, I've been wondering, how do journalists think about their own future? Not what do you think the future is, but how are you thinking about it? And not just the reporters. I want to know everybody in the news, everybody within the news ecosystem, how are you thinking about the future? And so over the summer, I launched a global survey in partnership with Ipsos and with the amazing help of the Global Editors Network helping me to get the word out, as well as ONA and NLGJA and the National Hispanic Association of Journalists, NABJ, SND. We worked with all of these different groups to send this survey out because I was curious to know, given what I see coming, what is everybody doing today? And I, as of right now, published that survey. So that is now, if the Twitter is working on the back end, that is available to the public. And it's important, and I want to share some of the key findings with you, because they're not good. So 69% of the newsrooms that participated in this are not actively engaging in tracking how emerging technology trends will impact the news 5 to 10 years from now. That was horrifying to me. And the reason that it's horrifying is because all of you should be able to do what I do, because it's the same skill set. It's just that we're frazzled, and there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of changes and consolidation and layoffs and all these different things happening. So we keep punting the future. We keep pushing it off further and further down the road. Everybody's talking about the future, but very few news organizations are taking real action. And when I asked questions about how are you thinking, I asked it in lots of different ways. So are you getting together once a quarter with your colleagues and batting around ideas? Are you reading research? Are you doing your own original research? What are you doing? And the answer is most news organizations aren't doing much at all. 58% of those participating in the survey said that they rarely think about the next 10 to 20 years of journalism. 78% never engage in any long-term planning or scenario mapping at all. And this, to me, was the most striking and disheartening finding, and that is that news organization staff between the ages of 44 and 64 are what I would call nowists. Their primary thoughts, the thing that they focus on, is the next 12 months. Now, that makes sense. News organizations are having a rough time. Between this crazy news cycle and changes in technology and budget issues, it makes complete sense that the people in this age group who are the managers of the organizations are just trying to stay afloat. But they're also the ones making the decisions about the future. And this is the group that's not doing any substantive thought. So again, the thing that bothers me most is that these are the people who are making decisions about what happens with the future of news, about the partnerships that they have with those big 9 AI companies, and who has leverage within those relationships. And so I'll tell you something. While I'm concerned about our baby-faced leader halfway around the world and his access to a nuclear arsenal, I'm actually more worried about the future of journalism. The reason that I'm worried about the future of journalism is because it is journalism that keeps democracy flowing. It is journalism that keeps our populace informed. The past 10 years of doing this, I guess 9 years, these are all the previous presentations, I've come and I've shown some trends that are a part of a bigger body of work that I'm working on. And this is hard to see. It's a map, a network map, which is hard to see. But it comes from several hundred trends that I'm tracking at any given time. And trends are not trendy things, they're not shiny objects. They are fundamental shifts in human behavior and humans as we relate to technology and to information. So normally what I do is I come and show some of that work. I am concerned enough about what I'm now seeing. I believe that we are on this event horizon, that what I've done instead is created an entire report just for you. So this is it. It's now live, and there are 75 trends that everybody should be paying attention to. And this is them. So just take a picture. No, don't do that. I've also created a Dropbox folder that I will tweet out towards the end of the presentation. Everything is here for you. It is all free, and it is intended for you to use in your newsrooms because I want everybody to leave here today and to come back to ONA next year and call yourself a futurist as well. So every single trend has the name of the trend, how many years we've been tracking it, because in my work, again, things aren't trendy, so we tend to track things over many, many years. What you should know about it, examples of it, what we think are coming next, and which companies you need to be paying attention to. And importantly, at the top, you'll see a little matrix. And the matrix tells you, given what we know to be true today, whether you should take action right now, whether this should just inform your strategy, whether you should revisit it later, or whether you should keep vigilant watch. I wrote this report, which is 100 pages long, not just for the managers of the newsrooms. I wrote this for everybody, because I believe every person who works within the field has a stake in our future, and so I want all of you engaged over the next 10 years in doing the same work. Futurists use trends to make connections and to build scenarios. So the trends aren't the end. The trends are what we use to understand and see what's coming next. So what I'm going to do is, I can't show you all 75 trends. That would be a lot. Instead, I'm going to go through 11. And I've grouped them the way that I'm going to walk you through my thinking as a futurist. I've grouped them into 3 different trend clusters. And what I'm going to do is explain to you those trends, show you where we end up if there's no change made in the next 10 years. And I'm going to do all this by asking you 3 basic questions. So, as I ask you these questions, and I show you all of this stuff, I want to invite you to think like a futurist, which is to say, try not to think in a linear way. If this, then only that. Instead, I want you to think, okay, well, if she says this, what are all the possible spokes? And I want you to think about the present and about the past and about the future simultaneously. So we're all going to do this together today. And I'm going to show you probable scenarios for the future of news. So the first trend cluster has to do with computational photography, adversarial machine learning, object recognition, and CubeSats. And this all falls within this sort of bigger cluster of visual computing. And the question that I want you to consider, this is a basic question, right? It seems silly, but try to think about this question in a more critical, new way. Why should journalists, why should everybody in this room care about the future of visual computing? So let's break this down.
Show me pictures of a Maltese.
So I asked Google, if you can turn up the volume on my machine up there. So I asked Google to show me pictures of a Maltese, okay, with my voice. And this is what showed up. This isn't like groundbreaking, earth-shattering stuff, unless you think about this in a different way. So let's unpack this. I didn't just get photos of Malteses. What else is here? Somebody just shout it out. Right, there are different kinds of Malteses. Some are old, some are young. There's 2 of them. Some have long hair, some have short hair. And yet, even with all of these subtle changes, Google was still able to tell me that this is the Maltese, and that's what I asked it for. This is really important. It's an example of how we've trained machine learning systems to recognize people, objects, places, under all different kinds of circumstances. So it turns out that visual computing is now turning up in all different kinds of places. You may not even realize that that's what's happening. I want to show you a few. So this is an example, what she's got holding in her hand, of an infrared spectrometer. And if you point it at something, it will connect to your phone and tell you what you're looking at. So for example, you point it at cheese, it tells you that it's cheese, but it also tells you what kind of cheese it is and whether or not it's rancid. You can point it at a bottle of olive oil, and by analyzing the chemical compound using light in that bottle, it will tell you whether it's pure olive oil or it's been mixed with something else. This is an image that's been going around from NASA. Did anybody see this? Right, so this is the before and after of the hurricane that struck Puerto Rico. And we can see on the left-hand side what everything looked like before the lights went dark, and on the right-hand side what it looked like afterwards. This is an important reporting tool. It gives us a good sense of what the electrical grid looks like, and those are photos that are taken from space. But here's where we're going in the next 10 years. So there's something called CubeSats. These are tiny little cubes that look like a slightly bigger Rubik's Cube. They are capable of being deployed together, so you don't have to have one enormous satellite with one big launch. If one of them goes down, the rest of them stay online. They are easier and cheaper than traditional satellites, and thousands of these things are going to be launched over the next 10 years. Thousands of them. They're going to be all over the place, floating around the globe. The key difference is that rather than taking a photograph every month or every week, these are taking real-time images and beaming them back down to Earth. And it's actually not the satellite itself that's so impressive. It's the software that it connects to back down on the planet. And this becomes a visual computing tool that's invaluable for journalists. So for example, if you were able to count the number of ships at any given time and to compare data over a period of time, that tells you something about the movement of goods and services and people and any other kinds of things. This is an example of a forest in Germany that if you just took regular satellite images, it doesn't look very interesting. But this is using that analytical tool that comes along with the system. And this is a forest that's full of blight. So there's an environmental disaster that's sort of happened here. And it's in the middle of nowhere, so unless you're walking through the forest, you would never know. But it's actually a virus. It's a virus that's spreading throughout the forest. And this is an example of visual computing that we only are now able to do in short spurts, but all of you will have the ability to use over the next 10 years. These are powerful visual computing tools, again, that everybody will start to gain access to, and it shifts how we interpret information. So I want to show you a company. It's possibly one of the most important companies that's out there that you've never heard of before. They're based in China, and it's called Megvii. Megvii is a machine recognition visual computing system that recognizes people. So let me just show you what that looks like in practice. So it doesn't just recognize faces, it recognizes posture. And it turns out humans all have pretty unique postures. We all have a unique muscular skeleton system. And so what happens is this system has gotten really, really, really good at training itself to recognize not just our faces or the capillaries underneath our faces, but in fact, not even seeing our faces at all, and instead just recognizing how we move. And just in recognizing somebody walking down the street, it can ping you and let you know, oh, that's so-and-so, without ever actually seeing their face. You can also search by faces. So if you upload to there's an API. So if you play around with the API and you start uploading faces, it will tell you all different kinds of things. So it's tracking like hundreds of different attributes, data points all around the face. So I scanned Bill Gates' photo from Twitter. This is it. And I was able to drill down. It recognizes not who he is, but the attributes, right? So it didn't tell me this is Bill Gates. It told me, oh, this person is probably 65 years old. He's male. He's smiling, right? And it goes on and on and on. And then I used it to find other people who look like him. So as it turns out, there's like hundreds of people that look just like Bill Gates. Now here's why this is important. This is a project that came out of China. China has a very, very different public stance towards privacy than there is in Europe and than there is in the United States. It's also important to note that more than any other nation in the world, China is throwing the full resources of its government and its sovereign wealth into AI. China has filed more patents in AI than anybody else in the planet. China has a better capitalized system to fund AI experiments, to fund researchers than anybody else on the planet, and they have hundreds of millions of people. So part of the reason why this system has gotten so good is because there's 800 million people that are included in it, and it has government support. So systems similar to this are all over the place in China. So this is a visual computing application that's been launched by Alibaba called Smile to Pay. So if you walk up and you can use face recognition without your phone and process a transaction, what's interesting about this is that it also works even if you've got different hair. So on the right-hand side, people have worn silly-looking wigs, and they're standing in front, and they've got all kinds of crazy makeup on. It's still able to zero in on the person, recognize her, and process the payment. Now that's pretty cool, but there are ways in which this system is used that also undermines democracy, right? And civil liberties. So this is an example of a similar system being used in Shandong as people are crossing the street, jaywalking, There's no cars in sight, but jaywalking is a no-no. They are being recognized by their face and by their posture. They're being put up on a screen that everybody else can see and publicly shamed. And in addition to just showing their faces and revealing their identities, this is also connected to Weibo. And so it's a huge popular social network in China. And they're sending out this information. It basically gives his name and who he is and how old he is and explains that he was breaking one of society's laws in China. Visual computing allows us to do things like recognize and interpret human health, emotion, and characteristics. So one of the ways that this is being used now is new research out of the J. Ventnor Institute. And they've taken DNA samples, fed it into the system. Again, we've trained the systems to recognize things. And they have created 3D renderings of what the person looks like, whose DNA that belongs to. And so this is an example. On the left-hand side is the real person. That's the real face. On the right-hand side, that's the face that the computer generated based only on his DNA. And there's lots and lots of examples of that. There's another body of work where deep neural networks are now being trained to recognize sexuality looking at faces. Did anybody hear about the GADAR AI system? Yeah, so some of you are kind of laughing, but this was a real study that was done. It used the VGG deep learning algorithm. They scraped 70,000 photos of gay and straight people from a dating website and trained the system to recognize a gay person from a straight person just by looking at them. That's what we are training our computers to do. And this is what the computer said on the left-hand side. This is what a straight face, composite face, looks like. And on the right-hand side, this is what the gay version of that face looks like. That should have every single person sitting in this room feeling pretty uncomfortable. Also within visual computing, recognizing objects and interpreting data in augmented reality. So AR is now everywhere, right? In the past week, Snap has announced its WorldLens AR system, which is tied to advertising. Google announced Pixel stickers. But this is something we've been talking about for a while. So in 2015, in 2016, I talked about the advent of AR and how AR offers many more promising scenarios for journalists than VR. But it's a matter of sort of cracking that nut early. Well, now we're starting to see the manifestation of those trends from a few years ago. So here's where we go within the next 10 years. So I alluded to earlier these prototypes of glasses, of wearable devices. This isn't sort of flights of fancy. So I know lots of people who have working prototypes of glasses that look just like mine. There's a lot of money now flowing between technology companies and companies that make the lenses of the glasses and the frames of the glasses that we have. And the glasses alone won't allow us to do many of the things that our smartphones can do. So there's a whole bunch of people also working on rings and wristbands that would be used along with this. And the idea would be that 10 years from now, all of the things that we do that require us to hold our smartphones up like this, we are still doing all of those things. We just don't have a smartphone there. We are looking out, and the entire world is a sort of giant canvas for us. The physical realm and the digital realm are melded. And so that we can still do our video calls and take our selfies, we have either a wristband or a ring that allows us to reflect back and see that information. All right? And what this allows journalists, but then also everyday people to do, is to be out on the street and say, oh, I think I know that guy, but I can't remember who he is. Maybe I'll take a look at his posture, because I can't entirely see his face, and find out, oh, this is Toshi, right? Or, wow, that guy's camera is sweet. I wonder what it is. I wonder what he's using. And without actually having to talk to him, because why would we do that? We take a look, we make a glance, and we get that information. Or we say, this woman's amazingly gorgeous. She's got beautiful glasses. She looks great in this dress. I want to have both. I can not only find that information, but my AR system is linked to a bank account. And I can glance to approve that purchase, and it arrives at my house by the time that I get home in the size that suits me. That's what we're heading towards. But in order for all of this to happen, we also have to train machines to make mistakes. So there is an entire field called adversarial information, right? And adversarial examples are imperceptible to humans. So this is a correctly identified picture of a panda on the left. There's one pixel out of place in the center. And on the right-hand side, you can see that that has affected how the machines have labeled that image. It now says that it's a gibbon, right? There are lots of examples of this, and we're doing this researchers do this on purpose because machines learn just like toddlers do. And if they're not told correct from incorrect, then they learn incorrect information. But there are ways that you can intentionally screw around with the systems. So here's another 3 examples. It's a washer and dryer. It's correctly identified on the left-hand side. In the middle column, the top one is labeled as a safe, and the bottom one is labeled as a washer. And on the third side, the top one is labeled as a safe, and the bottom one is labeled as a loudspeaker. But I could literally also train the machine to recognize that bottom speaker as Steve Dorsey, my friend, who's walking in. Hello, Steve. So what's the impact on this? The impact is that we could have a bad actor. I mean, you're worried about fake news now. You have no idea what's coming. Okay? We could have a bad actor intentionally introducing adversarial information in order to create widespread solution, but to use and harness machine learning systems to do that on their behalf. So now let me show you how this unfolds. If there's no changes made today, here's where we're headed 10 years from now. And again, these aren't predictions. This is all based in the data that I've got and the research and the modeling. This is what happens 10 years from now. In an optimistic framing, which means you all leave and we all decide we're going to do something about this, optimistic framing for news, visual computing becomes a hugely powerful reporting tool. It's also a distribution platform. News organizations develop a sustainable business model to make visual news compelling and also to have it make money. For society, researchers stop encoding bias into the system. We don't train our machines on what, to have gaydar, because that's not a good thing to do. Everything that we can see can be searched, and so we understand the world better, we make better choices, we make better decisions. The world is a lovely place. Pragmatic framing, right? If we're taking a pragmatic view, news organizations never come up with a model for visual computing. Distribution becomes even more diffused, and it becomes harder and harder, even harder than it is today, to sustain news organizations. We wind up with consolidation. Many go out of business. The pragmatic framing for society 10 years from now, cognitive bias wins over. We keep teaching machines and computers to recognize and to learn stereotypes. And some academics do this for totally reasonable reasons, but others don't. We wind up at the advent of a widespread digital discrimination that we claim to not have been able to think through in advance. Companies promise to make improvements to their algorithms, but there are very little changes. And the catastrophic framing for news, visual computing arrives in the marketplace. News organizations have no business model, so they're not ready. They lose advertisers, they lose market share to visual news platforms and startups, and there's massive consolidation and huge amounts of layoffs. The catastrophic framing for society, we wind up with digital graffiti all over the place that we no longer can control because it's hard to even tell where that graffiti is coming from. We have adversarial examples all over the place. We're not even sure if we can trust what we're looking at. It's even harder to detect fake news, and machines who have been trained on these horrible stereotypes now make actual decisions for us that impact our lives. If I were to go through a probabilistic model and tell you where I'm feeling here, I would say there's 0% chance that the optimistic framings happen, because nobody's working on this. I would say there's a 70% chance of the pragmatic framing happening and about a 30% chance of the catastrophic framing. So let's now go on to the second set of trend clusters. All of these have to do with the future of voice, speaking to machines. So those are voice interfaces, generative algorithms, audio search, and machine reading comprehension. And the question that I want you to think through, which is, again, a really basic, simple question, but I want you to think about this in a new way, is why should journalists, why should every single person in this room care about the future of voice interfaces in a critical way? So We now have deep learning for machine reading comprehension. So this is the same thing as you reading a book and being able to tell me afterwards, not just read it and recite it, but tell me afterwards what it is that you've read and to extract some meaning out of it. So on Google, I typed this into search. Can you take guns into a hotel in Las Vegas? And the search return was this, right? So it's a whole bunch of links. And it's links to news stories, it's links to TripAdvisor, it's just a bunch of URLs, which is what it's supposed to do, okay? But it doesn't really get me the answer to that question. Now, there are cases in our search engines where semantic search is in play and we can ask a question like, how old is Will Wheaton? And we will immediately get to the answer, but we're not quite there yet with the rest of our information. However, one of the links, one of the many, many, many links that I found, took me to this story, which is a great story, and from NPR. And once I read all the way through that story, pretty far down, I finally did get to my answer. But there were a lot of steps that were required by me, the consumer. So that takes me to what's happening at Microsoft and Stanford. They are doing an entirely huge body of work on machine reading comprehension research. And the idea here is to take us from asking that question to getting us immediately the answer. Here's why this is important. Because machine reading comprehension is what lays the groundwork for our future conversations with machines, right? If we were to ask that same question to Alexa, and Alexa just starts reading me back random answers, that's not useful. So everybody who's working on voice is also working on machine reading comprehension. And I want to show you something that just launched. It's called Audio Burst. Has anybody tried Audio Burst first yet? I'm losing my ability to talk. OK, so Audio Burst is a living example of MRC in play now within the news world. And what's interesting is that news organizations don't seem to know that this is working just yet. So I asked the same question. Can you take guns into hotel rooms in Las Vegas? And what it did was it went through, it's not cataloging all audio stories, radio stories, it's got a few, but it went through everything very, very quickly, read through the transcripts of all of those stories, and then didn't give me a list of information where I can get the answer. Instead, it just gave me the information. Okay, so this is, and I did this on the web.
His suitcase has nearly 24 guns into his room on the 32nd floor.
So this goes sort of on, but it explains the answer to that, and it was coming from WGN. But this also works on Alexa. So there's an Alexa skill, and what this allowed me to do standing in my kitchen was to ask the same question, and instead of having some possible answers or news sources, it just told me the answer.
Alexa, ask Newsfeed if I can take guns into hotel rooms in Las Vegas.
Takes a while. It took 30 seconds to get the answer.
I found the following 5 bursts on. I take guns hotel rooms Las Vegas. Aired 22 hours ago on 790 KBC.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Are you in Las Vegas?
So this is the part of the show where they address this.
What's it like there?
All right. This is incredibly important. This is incredibly important because 10 years from now, we will be in an era of zero UI. Okay? Conversational interfaces, where we are surrounded by machines. We are not inputting information this way. We are talking to them. 50% of the people within industrialized nations will begin to interact with computers only using their voice 3 years from now. So this is going to ramp up quickly. And this is not everybody on the planet, but this is a lot of people in America. This is a lot of people in the UK and in Europe and in Japan and in other areas around the world. Now, does anybody know where that news, when I had that conversation with the machine, with Alexa just now, did anybody catch the source on that? Newsfeed, except that Newsfeed is the name for where all of the information comes from. It was said, but it was said very, very quickly, and it was almost inaudible, and that's a problem. It's a problem because in a zero UI setting, it's going to be awkward to cite sources and news brands. If the idea is that we are going to have this seamless interaction with machines and just have conversations with them, has anybody yet thought through the implications for that on the news organizations where the information comes from, right? Because it would be awkward for me to be talking to Alexa and for every 5 seconds for Alexa to say, according to the New York Times on November 2nd, 1999, and then have that information. But then also according to ProPublica on December 3rd, 2011, blah, 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 right? That's not how we would normally talk to each other. And nobody's really thought that through. And the impact of this is that these zero UI situations change how quickly people get very specific information. We get it faster. And what we are asking machines to do is to give us that information. We're putting an enormous amount of trust into the machines and the algorithms to start making decisions for us. And it removes news brands from the conversation unless I'm only having the conversation with one news brand. And then how do you even monetize this? So once we have zero UI and we are talking to machines, at this point, how do news organizations make money? In an era where we are talking to machines, we don't see the masthead, we don't see an advertisement that comes along with it. How, at that point, are you sustainable? And by the way, these 9 companies are also the ones who are building the conversational feature of conversational UIs. It's the same group of people, right? Same group of companies, same focus area. So within this area of voice, generative algorithms are also being used and tested. So this is some work out of CSAIL. What they've done is they've gone around and trained machines to generate sound just like we would. So this is somebody banging a stick on different surfaces, and then after a while, if you say to the system, what does it sound like when I hit a drumstick on a bunch of leaves, it generates that sound for you, and it's past the audio equivalent of the Turing test. So humans don't know the difference, what was the real sound versus what was computer generated. Lyrebird is a pretty interesting startup that will generate audio. You can train a voice, and it will automatically generate that voice for you. And so here's an example of Donald Trump reading his own tweets, but he actually never said these things out loud.
North Korea has conducted a major nuclear test. Their words and actions continue to be very hostile and dangerous to the United States.
All right, now that sounds kind of janky, but if you were in a rush and we are trained to take in news very quickly now, would you stop and say, wait a minute, was that computer generated? And now let's keep in mind that we have people all over the place who are deleting their tweets all the time. If you haven't seen PolitiWhoops, this is one of the most clever journalism projects I've seen from ProPublica. It's tracking every single deleted tweet from our elected officials, and it's amazing, right? But that tweet still, if we were able to create the audio in an automatic way, we now have an audio record of things that Donald Trump said in his own voice that he has tried to delete from the public record. And if you combine everything that I just talked about in voice with everything that I talked about in the first set of trends, which is, again, another way that futurists think, we don't think in a linear way, we're constantly making connections between things, then where do we arrive? So this is an example of object generation. I probably should have attempted to put some makeup on or something since I'm showing this to you. I didn't. I'm sitting at home in my home office, and I made a 3D face. And on the left-hand side, that was me moving my face around. On the right-hand side, I was able to create my own face in 3D. I didn't have to do anything. I just hit enter. And it took less than 10 seconds. So I can render my own 3D face. We know that we can render voice. And we also know, because this is new, also research out of CSAIL, at MIT, that we can render video from a still image. So this is tiny and hard to see, but on the left column, this is a single image of a human doing something, and the right column is that video completed. This is what the machines predicted that the human would do next. Here's where we arrive. We arrive at the University of Washington creating a video. Now, this is a video of President Obama actually speaking, but
for other people, us being thoughtful about other people's traditions.
This is what he was saying in the interview on the left. On the right, this is something that was generated.
You talked about what we talk about over the dinner table. A lot of what we talk about over the dinner table is, we live in a diverse world.
It's pretty convincing. He never said any of that, right? So here are the scenarios for the next 10 years. In an optimistic framing, news organizations recognize voice as a top priority across all business units And leaders start working on radically different business models to test immediately. News organizations thrive once we hit this zero UI, and once it enters the mainstream, 10 to 15 to 20 years from now. The optimistic framing for society, journalists develop ways to authenticate video using artificial intelligence before using or distributing it. Facebook, Google, and Twitter develop authentication systems. They downgrade or block fake videos. We have a much more informed electorate all around the world. The pragmatic framing, news organizations keep launching Alexa skills, which is fine. You have to learn how the systems work. But you have no leverage because you never develop a business strategy to support voice. Once all of the zero UIs go mainstream, news organizations start to lose revenue very, very quickly. We wind up with widespread media consolidation and layoffs. In society, those big 9 companies that are working on AI, they don't care about real partnerships, real meaningful partnerships with news organizations. Fake news winds up proliferating, reporters get duped, trust in journalism further erodes, and we are less confident, and we wind up with civil unrest. And in the catastrophic framing for news organizations never develop a model for the era of zero UIs. They have no reasonable way to monetize their content. We wind up with widespread closures, journalists out of work. And things don't look good for society. Fake news stories dupe our global leaders. We have widespread rioting, confusion, violence. The public winds up misinformed. And we wind up in some kind of serious cyber or nuclear war. So in the probabilistic model, again, 0% chance, I think, of the optimistic framing happening, because nobody's working in that area yet. I think there's an 80% chance of the pragmatic framing, and at the moment, a 20% chance of the catastrophic framing happening. So to wrap things up, I want to go through the final 3 trends, and that has to do with access. And I'm going to talk about splinternets, radical transparency, and how we might start using blockchain for news over the next 10 years. And the question I want you to think through is, why should journalists, why should everybody sitting in this room care about access to quality news? Not for the usual reasons, but let's push ourselves and think a little harder. So this happened this week. CBS, and I will say, I wasn't there. My hunch was that some producer at CBS talked to somebody at the LAPD who confirmed that Tom Petty had died, and CBS ran with that story. I don't think that anybody made anything up here. The problem is that the LAPD hadn't announced the death yet. And so in everybody's rush to get this information online and to be the first, what wound up happening was that the LAPD contradicted CBS on a public stage, saying they have no investigative role, we apologize for any inconvenience in the reporting, we are not confirming this. And what winds up, even though if we stop for a moment and just logically think through what probably happened, CBS probably didn't do anything wrong here, right? The challenge is that in this era where people mistrust the news from credible sources, this built on top of that. We had NBC News reporting an exclusive this past week that Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State in the United States, at a DOD meeting, called President Trump a moron. Did that happen? Probably, right? I know that he's been called far worse inside the building. The problem is we now have everybody saying that the story was made up. And the challenge here is that speed is incongruous most of the time with quality, especially in our area of machine learning, right? There's a pretty good direct line. If I were to put the Google 4chan story, which was rushing to get something up relating to the topic of the Las Vegas shooting, I would put that at the sort of bottom. It's super fast, terrible quality, right? On the other end of that is ProPublica, which consistently churns out amazingly good and important investigative stories that take time. In our modern distribution system, the systems that we use, they were built for speed. The internet, as it has matured, was built for speed, not for accuracy and reporting. And that doesn't, that's not your fault. You are all, quality journalists who are producing important information. The problem comes with distribution. And regardless of whether or not anybody from Twitter will admit this in public or anywhere else, Twitter is our 21st century wire service. And yesterday, when Ev Williams wouldn't really talk through the implications of fake news, I understand that, he's a board member, but somebody asked, isn't this something you could have thought through in advance? And the answer was, yeah, maybe we should have thought through it, right? It's irresponsible not to think through scenarios for how all of this technology will ultimately change how we relate to each other. Facebook is approaching $500 billion in market cap. Okay, these are enormous companies. In Facebook's case, it's a lot of money, and in Twitter's case, it's a lot of power because of the spread and breadth of that distribution system. In the next 10 years, all of these platforms and these distributors are going to start facing government regulation, which will further change things. Now, that brings me to something called the splinternet. I didn't make this term up. This is something that different folks have been talking about in different ways. But the idea here is that the World Wide Web is no longer the World Wide Web where free information flows. This is a map that shows you where there is current or pending legislation or court hearings that are pending on different rules for every single country, right? So the internet will start behaving differently in all of these different places. In Germany, social networks one of the cases, social networks will have to delete hate speech within 24 hours of posting, or they'll be fined $57 million per instance. In Europe, there's obviously, we all know, the right to be forgotten law. Google has to remove pages if requested. In Canada, Google has to scrub pirated products from results. This is just a handful of the examples of all of the pending rules, changes, and legislation all over the world, which means that this could wind up being our future within the next 10 years. Regional splinternets, where Russia and China have their own thing. Russia already has its own version of VKontakte, but it has many other systems that we don't have access to, and it's about to kick out some of the systems that we do have access to. We could wind up with China having its own system, India being separated from us, Europe being separated. We could wind up with the rules of the internet and how information flows being completely different, regardless, depending on where you are in the world. And the problem is, journalism flows, could wind up flowing differently through each splinternet's geographic boundaries. And if you think we have a problem today with misinformation, can you imagine a world in which the flow of information is completely dependent on the region of the world that you're in, even different democracies that you happen to be in? And that takes me to blockchain. So this is, I'm sure you've heard of blockchain before. It's a way to authenticate information between two parties. And it's done in a public way so that once information hits a network, it's verified, and then the rest of the network has to verify that, and then the sort of transaction happens, right? And the reason that blockchain is promising and that everybody's talking about it is because it gets to the heart of public verification and authentication. All of these industries are now putting a ton of money and people into exploring and building out products for blockchain. So insurance is going to look different 10 years from now because of blockchain. Health, medicine, charity, law enforcement, shopping, crowdfunding, real estate. We're going to start to see all of our systems very, very different because of blockchain. And what do we do in journalism to verify? We put a little blue checkbox, right? Little blue check mark, and that's the verification, right? And we have a little blue thing on Facebook. And according to both pages, this is how you can know that the people are authentic. They're not saying that the news is authentic, but the people are authentic. Well, I'm an authentic person. Let me show you what happens. I'm going to combine now everything that I talked to you about and link everything together. Here's where we wind up, right? Our current system is that A wants news from B, B wants to get the news to A, the whole fucking alphabet, right, has news. All of that news goes to a distribution monopoly controlled by Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, algorithms that they say they have absolutely no idea how they work because they're complicated and whatever else. The algorithms govern what gets seen by whom and when, and then A can't find trustworthy news anywhere. So this should not come as a surprise to anybody, all right? And I'm one of those verified people. So a couple days ago, I posted, I just won the Maryland lottery. I'm rich. And there was a very funny Simpsons gif that went along with it. And I deleted that tweet right away because I was curious to see what might happen. And my friend Andrew said, hey, everybody, it's fine. I caught it. Hey, everyone, Amy's rich now. And there's a screenshot of it. And I thought that would go away. But then Josh Stearns added on, and he was like, hey, since I missed it, does that mean that I can start some kind of conspiracy? So this was kind of funny, right? And it was kind of clever and funny. But my point here was to figure out what happens, like how does this happen so quickly, and to be able to show it to you. Because I'm one of those, all of us are verified people, and we've all now spread a whole bunch of fake news, because I did not win the lottery. Yet.
And for your son, the only option
Let me go back. And I want to play this scenario out for you. This was a great podcast called Rough Translation, featuring Ruslan, who had been at VOA. He's a reporter based in Ukraine. But I want him to explain to you how splinternets and the lack of verification winds up leading to serious problems within a country.
And for Ruslan, the only option left was the one that he'd once begged the Ukrainian government not to do, to censor the Russian news channels.
I changed my mind dramatically. I was 100% sure, I was damn sure that we need to cut it right away.
StopFake handed its archive of Russian propaganda techniques to the Ukrainian government, which promptly used it as evidence.
If we did it earlier, I think we might avoid a lot of deaths.
Okay? He just said, I will summarize. So he started this thing called Stop Fake in Ukraine, and the whole point of it was to come up with all of these different tools and ways to monitor the spread of Russian misinformation. And he has now basically said, and he's handed over all of the tools to the government, and he's asked the government to censor. That's the situation that they wound up in, because nobody was controlling or thinking about the flow of information. And it resulted in deaths in Ukraine. So let's map this out. What happens by the year 2029? And then we're done. Optimistic framing for news. News organizations join together. They insist on verification and radical transparency. News organizations gain market share. Consumers pay for access. The industry is sustainable. And here's how I think the blockchain can help us do that. It can help disrupt in a very good way news and information. A is a credible news organization. They want to distribute trustworthy news. The transaction is represented as news atom blocks. So every single piece of that news, whether it's a hyperlink or an object or a photo or whatever it might be, is treated as a block. That news atom block is distributed to the network. The network approves the source as verified. The news atom is added to a public ledger of content, which means search pulls up only news content that is now trusted and verified. People wind up more informed. Trust is regained, and we all go back to living into some sense of normalcy, where people needed journalists and believed what journalists had to say. The optimistic framing for society. Splinternets are avoided. The news cycle slows down to a more reasonable rate. Consumers see less fake news. Humanity is more informed. On the pragmatic side, the news cycle speeds up. It becomes even faster. Journalists wind up having to spend an equal amount of time correcting the record as they do reporting on original news stories. In society, trust in media starts to really erode. Regional splinternets become a real thing. Google and Facebook spend hundreds of millions of dollars to develop regional systems that become unwieldy and difficult to manage, because now there's different rules across the entire internet, across the entire planet. Mistakes wind up being made, and fake news gets worse. And the catastrophic framing, news organizations lose market share to startups that publish what I would consider to be the equivalent of high-frequency trading, high-frequency news. So this is machine-driven, very, very rapid-paced news. Machine-generated stories are based on sentiment, what the systems think we want to read versus what the news actually is. And early details start to become the norm, so we wind up with different versions of stories, and it's hard to tell fact from fiction. News organizations collapse. The catastrophic framing for society. Distributors cannot manage a global system of splinternets. It becomes too unwieldy and difficult. Systems are vulnerable to attack. We wind up with widespread misinformation campaigns, and democracy crumbles. And at the moment, given what I know to be true today, right, I would say there's, and I'm not I'm serious. I think there's a 50-50% chance that we could wind up in one of those two situations. Now, I haven't shown you any confidence in any of the optimistic scenarios so far, right? This is not because I'm a pessimist. I'm not somebody who's constantly thinking in terms of doom. I'm a pragmatist. But I'm a pragmatist who believes that if we make different decisions starting right now, that we can chart a different course toward the future, because these scenarios haven't happened yet. And I believe that every single person sitting in this room, and I mean this, every one of you, I believe that you have the power to create the future that you want. And in order to do that, I don't want you to become early adopters. I don't want you to go out and find all the latest, coolest tech. I want you to become early adapters. I want you to start thinking in a different way. I want you to adapt to the changes that are coming, and I want everybody to start taking incremental action on trends every single day. And this brings me back to the bees. So as of right now, if my Twitter on the back end worked, I've just tweeted out a link to a Dropbox folder. I'm giving everything away. So all of my IP, all of my research, details on how I do all of this stuff, that is all now sitting in a folder, and it's my gift to you. And the reason that I'm doing this, and this is the folder, there's no commercial anything here. I'm not advising any news organizations. I'm doing this because I am very, very concerned. And I believe that everybody in here can change the direction that we're heading in. But in order to do that, you've got to be prepared. So everything that I've ever done now, my entire body of work, is on Dropbox, and it's all free. And I want you to take it, and you don't even have to cite me or reference me back to it. I just want you to start using it. So that's the folder. It has the methodology, so it explains how to do all of this. And it has a bunch of other tools that you can take back to your newsrooms and do whatever you want with. And I swear to you, you can put your own labels on it, do whatever you want. I just want everybody to start thinking radically different about the future. And to keep in mind that the future hasn't been written yet, that in fact it's up to every single person sitting in this room. So with that, I want to say thank you for coming, and I want to encourage and motivate all of you to leave and to go create a future that we all want for ourselves. Thank you.